In the autumn of 1885, an architect named Bruce Price was standing in his own office in New York while a client walked out of it. The client was leaving. He had his hat, and on the way through the door he called back over his shoulder, without turning around, that he had changed his mind. Make it 4 cottages more instead of 2. Show me the plans tomorrow. Break ground for them next Monday. Then he was gone, and Bruce Price was left holding a Monday deadline for 4 houses that had not existed as an idea 90 seconds earlier. The client was Pierre Lorillard IV, and what he was building was not 4 houses. It was a town. 8 months later, on the 1st of June 1886, a stretch of rocky forest in the Ramapo Mountains of New York opened as a finished settlement. 30 miles of graded road, a complete water and sewage system, a police station, 2 blocks of stores, a dam, an ice house, a fish hatchery, a swimming tank, stables, 22 mansions, and a clubhouse looking out over a lake. Around all of it ran a barbed wire fence 8 feet high, patrolled around the clock by a private police force that Lorillard paid for himself. Roughly 1,800 men built it, most of them Italian, some of them Slav, recruited off the docks in New York Harbor and housed in shanties thrown up just outside the boundary of the thing they were making. The place was called Tuxedo Park, and the reason you have heard the word before is that 4 separate things got out through that fence and spread across the country. One of them is probably hanging in your closet. One of them is the reason your neighborhood has a committee, and one of them is a rule about who is allowed to buy a house that now governs somewhere in the region of 7 million American households. So the question is not how Tuxedo Park was built. That took 8 months, and we know how it was done. The question is how far it got. Start with the man leaving the office. The Lorillards were one of the oldest fortunes in America, and the fortune was tobacco. The family firm went back to the 1760s in New York when a French immigrant named Pierre Lorillard began processing snuff on the Hudson. By the middle of the 19th century, the name was on cigarette packets across the country. That kind of money is a specific kind of money. It is old. It was made by ancestors. And in the New York of the 1880s, that distinction was becoming the most important social fact in the city. There is a story that the family firm is where the word millionaire entered American English, coined in an obituary for an earlier Lorillard. It is a good story, and it is almost certainly not true, but the fact that it attached itself to this family rather than some other one tells you how the name sat in the American ear. The land itself came to them the way a lot of American land came to old families, which is sideways. Pierre Lorillard IV had inherited, among other things, roughly 13,000 acres of mountain land around a lake in Orange County, about 40 miles northwest of Manhattan. His grandfather had picked it up generations earlier for the timber and the iron. Nobody had done anything with it. It was rock, forest and ravine, useful for shooting and fishing and almost nothing else. Lorillard himself was a sportsman first and a businessman second. He raced horses, he owned yachts. He had a summer house at Newport called the Breakers, which he sold to Cornelius Vanderbilt II in 1882, and which the Vanderbilts then rebuilt into the enormous marble palace that tourists visit today. He was also, by every account that survives, a difficult man to work for. Imperious is the word that comes up. The story about the 4 cottages is not an isolated anecdote. It is how he operated. He ordered buildings the way other men ordered a drink, so he had land, money and a temperament that did not tolerate obstacles. What he did not have yet was a reason. The reason was happening in New York City, and it was a crisis. For most of the 19th century, New York society had run on a fairly stable arrangement. At the top were the old Dutch and English families, the Knickerbockers, whose money came from land and shipping and went back to the colonial period. Just below them sat the mercantile families who had made money after the Revolution and had since been absorbed. It was a closed circuit. Everybody in it knew everybody else in it, and crucially, the system worked because it was small enough to be held in one person's head. Then the Civil War ended, and the country got extremely rich extremely fast. Railroads, steel, oil, mining, banking. Fortunes appeared in a decade that were larger than anything the old families had accumulated over a century, and they appeared in the hands of people the old families had never heard of. That created a practical difficulty. Money had always been the filter. If you could afford the house, the carriage, the box at the opera, you were plausibly the right sort of person. because getting that much money used to require several generations and a certain kind of connection. That was no longer true. By the 1880s, there were men in New York who could outspend any knickerbocker in the city, and who had been operating a dry goods counter 15 years earlier. The filter had stopped filtering. The social historian E. Digby Baltzell later described what came next as a caricature of the Victorian millionaire's mania for exclusiveness. He was describing Tuxedo Park specifically, but the mania was general, and it produced a whole set of improvised solutions. Mrs. Astor and Ward McAllister famously came up with the 400, the notion that only about 400 people in New York actually mattered, a number supposedly derived from the capacity of Mrs. Astor's ballroom. That was one approach. Draw up a list. The trouble with a list is that it has no enforcement. Anybody can walk down a street. Anybody can buy the house next door. Anybody with enough money can build something bigger than yours and put it in your eye line, and there is nothing whatsoever you can do about it. Which is the thought that turns a sportsman with 13,000 acres into a developer. If you cannot control who is in the city, you can control who is inside a fence. And if you own the land the fence encloses, you can control who is permitted to buy any part of it, forever, by contract. That is the idea. It is not a complicated idea. What makes Tuxedo Park significant is not the idea but the execution, because Lorillard did something that almost nobody attempting this had done before. He did not build a house and then invite friends. He built the entire apparatus of a town first, all at once, and then opened the gate and let people apply. Now, the 8 months. Lorillard hired 2 men. Bruce Price was the architect, a Baltimore-born designer in his early 40s who would later put up the Chateau Frontenac in Quebec City, and whose tuxedo cottages would go on to influence a young Frank Lloyd Wright. Ernest Bowditch of Boston handled the land planning and the engineering, which on this terrain was the harder job. Price deserves better than the walk-on part history has given him. He was working in a distinctly American idiom, shingled and gabled and low to the ground, houses that sat into a slope rather than on top of it. His tuxedo cottages were photographed and published widely, and a young draftsman in Chicago named Frank Lloyd Wright studied them. There is a real argument that the horizontal, ground-hugging American house that Wright spent his career developing has one of its roots in a set of holiday cottages built at speed for a tobacco heir who could not be bothered to give his architect a week's notice. Price also built 4 cottages on Pepperidge Road for himself and his family, and his daughter inherited all 4 of them. Hold that fact too. It becomes important later. Then Lorillard went and got the labour. The men were recruited in New York, largely at the docks, largely fresh off ships. Italians and Slavs, several hundred at a time, moved out to the Ramapos and put up in a temporary settlement of hastily built shanties. The shanties were located outside the park proper, which is a detail worth holding on to because it establishes something on day one about who the boundary was for. There is a hard limit on what can be said about these men, and it is worth naming it directly. The record keeps the architect's name and the engineer's name and the client's name. It does not keep theirs. We know roughly how many there were, roughly where they came from and what they built, and that is close to everything. Their descendants will appear later in this story, and by then they will have a name in the record, but it will be a collective one, the villagers. What they did in 8 months is difficult to overstate. They cut 30 miles of road out of a mountainside, graded dirt and macadam, following contours rather than fighting them, which was Bowditch's contribution, and which is why the roads still look like they grew there. They laid a complete water system and a complete sewage system for a settlement that had no residents yet. They dammed streams to shape the lakes. They built an ice house, because refrigeration did not exist and a resort needs ice. They built a fish hatchery, because a sportsman's park needs fish, and fish do not arrive on schedule. They built stables because everything moved by horse. They built 2 blocks of stores because a town 40 miles from Manhattan cannot send out for anything. They built a swimming tank. They built a police station before there was anybody to police. They built 22 cottages, which is the word Tuxedo used and kept using, and which meant a wooden or stuccoed house with somewhere between 5 and 10 bedrooms. They built the clubhouse on a rise above the water, which opened on the 16th of June 1886, and which was the actual point of the whole exercise, though nobody would have said so that plainly. And they built the gatehouse, a stone lodge at the entrance road, with the fence running away from it in both directions into the trees. Hold on to the gatehouse. It is the only structure in this story that is doing the same job today that it was doing in 1886, and by the end of this it will not mean what it means right now. Opening day was the 1st of June, 1886. The guests came up by train and were carried in past the lodge, and what they saw was not a construction site with a few finished buildings on it. It was a completed world, roads and lawns and lakes and houses that had not existed the previous autumn. That was the sales pitch, and it worked, and it was meant to. The speed was not incidental. The speed was the demonstration. A man who can conjure an entire town out of a ravine in 8 months is a man whose fence you can believe in. Now, a necessary interruption, because if you go looking into Tuxedo Park, you will immediately hit a problem with the numbers. The site is described in different sources as 5,000 acres, 6,000, 7,000, or the full 13,000 Lorillard inherited. The modern incorporated village is about 2,050. The build is 8 months in one account, 9 in another, 18 in a third. The cottages are 15, or 19, or 22, or 30, and the fence is 8 miles long in some tellings and 24 in others, which is not a rounding error. That is a factor of 3. Now, some of this is ordinary historical drift. Different sources are measuring different things at different dates, and a park that shrank over a century will produce different acreages depending on when someone looked. But some of it is something else, and the something else is the interesting part. Every one of those disputed numbers drifts in the same direction. Bigger fence, bigger acreage, faster build, more houses. Legends about places usually inflate along whatever axis the place was selling. Tuxedo Park was selling scale and separation, so scale and separation are the numbers that grew in the retelling. The exaggeration is not noise in the record. It is a measurement of what people wanted the place to be. What is not in dispute is that it was very large, that it went up astonishingly fast, and that there was a patrolled fence with a gatehouse on it. So the town exists. Now the part that actually matters, which is the rule. In most resort communities that have a club attached, the arrangement is obvious. You buy property, and buying property makes you a member. The land is the qualification. This is how Newport worked, more or less, and how nearly every country place in America worked before and since. Tuxedo inverted it. At Tuxedo Park, membership came first. You were admitted to the Tuxedo Club, or you were not, and only if you were admitted could you then acquire land inside the fence. Ownership was downstream of approval. The land was not for sale to the public at any price, because the public was not the customer. The customer was a person who had already been vetted. That is the whole invention. It sounds like a small administrative detail, and it is the opposite of one. The purest statement of it on record comes from a man named Gould Hoyt, an officer of the Tuxedo Park Association, and a member of the club's normally silent board of governors. He was speaking on an occasion when someone had alleged, wrongly as it turned out, that a person of bad character had managed to buy property in the park. Hoyt's explanation of why this was impossible is a small masterpiece of circular architecture. The association, he said, never sells land to anybody who is not a member of the club. All the property owners are members of the club, and none of them would sell to a person who would be likely to prove an undesirable resident. Such a person would scarcely want to buy either, because it would be decidedly unpleasant, he fancied, to be a resident of the park and not be admitted to the club. Read that again and watch it close on itself. You cannot buy in unless you are a member. Every owner is a member. No member would sell to an undesirable. And anyway, an undesirable would not want to buy, because owning a house among people who will not speak to you is intolerable. There is no gate in that sentence. There is no fence in it either. It is a self-sealing loop made entirely of contract and social pressure, and it does not require a single strand of barbed wire to function. The barbed wire, it turns out, was the least important part of the security system. It was the visible part. It was the part you could photograph and put in a brochure. But the machinery was the rule, and that rule is portable. A fence is expensive, needs patrolling, and only works on one specific piece of ground. A rule costs nothing, needs no maintenance, and can be written into a deed anywhere in the country. Keep that distinction in mind, because it is going to explain everything that happens in the last 20 minutes of this. How exclusive was it actually? The membership was capped at 200 gentlemen at the start. Demand was such that within a year the cap went to 400, not counting resident members. By 1888 there were 348 non-resident members and 29 resident members, and among them was a decent contingent of exactly the new money arrivals the place had theoretically been built to keep out, which tells you something honest about the whole enterprise. The reputation for exclusiveness was doing more work than the exclusiveness. A man named George Rushmore, who grew up in the park and whose father was one of the original members, put it about as flatly as anyone ever has. If a person could get a proposer and a seconder and kept quiet, he said, he was likely to make the grade without too much ancestral background. And then Rushmore added the line that gives the whole game away. The one way not to be elected, he said, was to buy a house in the park before election. There it is again. Not the wrong ancestors, not the wrong religion. The disqualifying act was trying to purchase your way in rather than being invited in. The sequence was the sacrament. Now, one more correction before we go any further, because there is a claim about Tuxedo Park that is repeated constantly, and that is not right. You will very often see it described as the first gated community in America. It was not. Llewellyn Park in New Jersey was founded in 1853, 33 years earlier, a private residential enclave with controlled entry, where Thomas Edison eventually lived. And the general idea is a great deal older than that. The Romans built walled residential compounds in Britain. In Tang Dynasty China, the residents of Chang'an lived in walled wards, with gates that guards closed at night. Walls around where people live are not an American invention, and they are not a 19th century invention. They're close to as old as cities, so if Tuxedo Park was not first, what was it? It was the first place in America to fuse three things into one product and sell them together. A physical barrier, a membership committee with the power to refuse, and a legal structure ensuring that the committee's decision travelled with the land in perpetuity to every future owner. Not a wall with a bylaw. That combination is the thing that spread, and it spread because it solved a problem that was not going away, which is that in a country with no aristocracy and no legal class system, people who want to be separate have to build the separation themselves privately and pay for it. It is worth being specific about who the machinery was aimed at, because a story like this can drift into treating exclusion as a matter of taste in dinner jackets. The stated criteria were about money, ancestry and conduct. The unstated ones were narrower than that. The park was overwhelmingly white and overwhelmingly Protestant, and it stayed that way by design rather than by accident. The Tuxedo Club maintained a bar on certain ethnic groups, which in the American usage of that period meant Jews first and Catholics not far behind, and it maintained that bar for the better part of a century. We know it was still formally in place in the late 1970s because a survey of the park published in 1978 noted without much comment that the Board of Governors had never seen fit to relax it, 92 years after the gate opened. Black Americans were present in the park continuously from 1886 onward, in service, not as members and not as owners. None of this was unusual for an American institution of that class in that period, and saying so is not a defense of it. It is the opposite. The point of this story is that the machinery was not exotic. It was ordinary, it was legal, and it was designed to be copied, which is why it was. Tuxedo Park is where the American version of that got its finished form. Everything after this is the story of the form escaping. But before it escapes, it is worth spending some time inside, because the interior life of the place is stranger than the fence. Tuxedo was a seasonal address, spring and autumn. The families who used it followed a migration route, wintering in the city or further south, summering at Newport or Bar Harbor, and coming to Tuxedo in the shoulder seasons for the shooting and the riding and each other. The high point of the year and the opening event of the entire New York social season was the club's Autumn Ball. The Autumn Ball was where Tuxedo debutantes made their formal appearance, which in the vocabulary of the time meant they were now available to be married, and everyone present understood the assignment. One observer of the period described the general activity as flirting, and noted that while sleigh bells jingled outside, the society bells jangled inside. The other peak was the week between Christmas and New Year, when the clubhouse filled and stayed full. A contemporary list of what went on there reads as a complete inventory of what people of that class did for fun. Pigeon shooting, coasting, skating, tobogganing, dancing, flirting, singing, card playing, and last but by no means least, eating and drinking. Everything on that list except the eating and drinking required the park to exist. That is the product, not the houses, the calendar. And underneath the calendar was an enormous amount of labour, which the calendar was designed not to notice. A cottage of the modest period, 5 to 10 bedrooms, ran on a staff, Not one or two people. A cook and a kitchen maid, housemaids, a laundress, a butler or a houseman, a nurse if there were children, a governess if the children were older, a coachman and grooms for the horses, and gardeners for grounds that were expected to look effortless. Multiply that by 100 houses, then add the club with its kitchens and its dining rooms and its greenkeepers, then add the stables, the stores, the ice house, the water and sewage systems, and the private police force patrolling the fence around the clock. At its height, the park probably required more people working in it than living in it, by a considerable margin. Almost none of them slept inside the fence. They walked in through the gate in the morning, and they walked out through it in the evening, past the lodge twice a day for 3 generations, which means the gatehouse was not mainly counting arrivals. Most of the traffic through that gate, most days, was the workforce. The barrier that defined the place was, in practice, a turnstile for the people it was built to exclude. Hold that image. It is going to matter enormously about an hour from now when they stop walking in. And the atmosphere inside was, by a wide margin, the most formal in the country. We have this on excellent authority, because the girl who grew up in the architect's house went on to become the single most influential writer on manners America ever produced. Bruce Price had one child, a daughter, born Emily Price in Baltimore around 1872. She spent a good part of her girlhood in the place her father was designing, and she married in Tuxedo Park in 1892. She's going to be central to the third act of this story. For the moment, she is simply the best witness we have to what it was like to live there. Tuxedo, she said later, was the most formal place in the world. Nobody ever waved or helloed or hi-ed at Tuxedo. You bowed when you shook hands, and first names were considered very bad form. There were only 5 men in Tuxedo, she said, who called her Emily, and never in formal society. 5 men in an entire town were permitted to use her first name. Understand what that indicates. Formality of that intensity is not decoration. It is a testing apparatus. Every interaction is a small examination that an outsider will fail instantly and visibly, without anyone having to say a word to them. The fence handled people who did not belong at the boundary. The manners handled the ones who got past it. And a system that finely tuned has a predictable side effect, which is that it becomes almost impossible to join even when you are formally allowed in. The original families intermarried extensively, generation after generation, until a large share of the park was cousins. New members who had passed every stated test and paid every stated fee arrived to find a cousinage rather than a community could not get inside it, and eventually gave up and left. The 1978 account of the park in American Heritage calls this the fence syndrome, and describes the result as snobbery in such concentrated and virulent doses that it produced a stifling air of complacency and stilted formality. And then it makes an observation worth stopping on. Individual residents often disliked it. They said so, it made no difference. It was a group affliction with no available cure, because no one person could stop performing it without paying the cost alone. Which brings us to the people who wanted out. Dorothy Draper was born into it. Her parents, the Tuckermans, were loyal Tuxedoites of the deepest kind. She grew up inside the fence, and she went on to become the most famous interior decorator in America, the woman whose enormous chintz and cabbage roses redecorated half the grand hotels in the country. Her verdict on her own childhood is the best sentence anybody ever produced about the place. "I couldn't stand Tuxedo," she said. "I can't stand any place with a fence around it. Tuxedo had holes in its fence and I escaped through one of them and married George Draper. But I still don't like the idea of that fence. She escaped through a hole in the fence. She's being figurative, and she's also not being figurative at all, because that is what marrying out of the park amounted to." Then there is Claremont Barnwell, who never got the chance. Barnwell was the first baby born inside Tuxedo Park on the 7th of June, 1888, 2 years and 6 days after the place opened. That distinction followed him for the rest of his life. He was the Tuxedo Baby, and there was no version of adulthood in which he stopped being the Tuxedo Baby. "All my life," he said, "it has been almost as much of a cross to bear as a bar sinister. A bar sinister, in heraldry, is the mark of illegitimate descent. He is saying that being born inside the fence marked him permanently, in a way he could not remove, and that the mark was closer to a stain than a credential. The man born furthest inside the walls experienced the walls as a life sentence. And then there is the story that shows the machinery snapping shut on an outsider in real time, which is the best single scene in the park's whole history. The Tuxedo Club had a court tennis building. Not lawn tennis. Court tennis, the medieval indoor game with the sloping roofs and the strange scoring, the oldest and most aristocratic racket sport there is, and one of the few that in that era simply could not be learned unless you had access to a court, and there were almost no courts. The club's tournament was the gold racket, and it was the pride of the place. Eventually, and with some reluctance, the governors opened it to outsiders. The reasoning was not complicated. Tuxedo had bred masters of the game, and social inferiors were not going to be able to compete with them. In 1906, a young man named Jay Gould II entered and won it. He was not an ideal outsider from the club's point of view. He was the grandson and namesake of Jay Gould, the railroad speculator, probably the most detested financier in America, and a man the old families regarded as the walking definition of what had gone wrong with the country. The next year he won it again. In 1908, he won it a third time, at which point the Board of Governors of the Tuxedo Club took decisive action. They abolished the tournament. Not restructured, not reseeded. They simply stopped holding the gold racket because the alternative was to keep handing it to Jay Gould's grandson in front of everybody. And when they finally revived it many years later, they wrote in a new rule. National title holders, past or present, were ineligible to compete, which was aimed at exactly one human being, because by then Jay Gould II had become one of the great players in the history of the sport and held the national championship for 20 consecutive years. That is the fence syndrome in its purest form. Presented with a person who beat them at their own game inside their own building under their own rules, the response was not to improve. It was to cancel the game and then write him out of the rulebook. Which raises the obvious question. If the place was that closed, that formal, that determined to keep the world out, then how did anything from inside it ever get out? The answer is that 4 things did, and the first one was a jacket. In October of 1886, 4 months after the park opened, the Tuxedo Club held its first autumn ball. Evening dress in 1886 was not a matter of taste. It was a uniform and it was rigid. A man attending a formal evening event wore a black tailcoat, a white waistcoat and a white bow tie. There were no options. The garment had tails and the tails went to the back of the knee, and a man who turned up in anything else was announcing something about himself. At that first ball, according to the society paper Town Topics, a young man named Griswold Lorillard turned up in something else. Griswold was Pierre IV's younger son, and he came in wearing a tailless dress coat and a waistcoat of scarlet satin. Town Topics reported that he looked for all the world like a royal footman. That sentence is the origin of the tuxedo, and it has been repeated for 140 years, and it is probably wrong. We will come back to why in a moment, because the wrongness is the good part. But first, the story as it is usually told, because it is a very good story. In this version, Griswold is a young man goofing on his elders. He is bored of the tails. The tails get in the way when you sit down, and they get in the way when you dance. So he takes a pair of scissors to a perfectly good tailcoat, puts on a bright red waistcoat for good measure, walks into the most formal room in America and detonates. There is a variant in which his father is the culprit. In that telling, Pierre Lorillard IV had commissioned a tailless black jacket from his tailor, intending to wear it himself, then lost his nerve at the last minute and did not put it on. His son and his son's friends had seen it, copied it, and went in wearing theirs. Either way, the mechanism is the same. The old men are scandalized, the young men are thrilled, and within a few years everybody is wearing it. Somebody in New York asks a man in one of these strange short jackets what on earth he's got on, and the answer is that this is what they wear up in Tuxedo. The name sticks. The garment is named after the fence. Now the problem. The Tuxedo Club's own account of it does not credit Griswold Lorillard at all. It credits a member named James Brown Potter, and the story goes back to England. Potter was a coffee broker, wealthy, one of the park's early residents. In the summer of 1886, a few months before that first autumn ball, he was in England with his wife Cora, who was a celebrated beauty and later an actress of some fame. At a court ball, the Potters were introduced to the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VII, who was a great enthusiast for beautiful women and a great enthusiast for clothes. He invited the couple to Sandringham, his country house, for the weekend. Potter, facing a weekend at a royal estate, did the sensible thing and asked his host what a man was supposed to wear to dinner there. The prince told him, and then he sent him to his own tailors, Henry Poole and Company of Savile Row, to have one made. The garment in question was a short jacket the prince had taken to wearing for dinner at his country house, rather than the full tailcoat. It was formal in its materials and its finish, and informal in its length, and it existed because the heir to the British throne wanted to be comfortable at dinner without looking sloppy. Potter had one made, brought it home to Tuxedo Park, and wore it. The other men at the club copied him. It became their informal dining uniform. They wore it down to Delmonico's in New York, people asked, and they got the answer about what they wear up in Tuxedo. So which is it? This is where it gets difficult, and where most retellings of this story quietly stop. Modern dress historians have gone back to the actual Town Topics wording, and the phrase used is a tailless dress coat. In the vocabulary of 1886, dress coat did not mean what we mean by a jacket. It meant the evening tailcoat specifically. So what Town Topics was describing was a tailcoat with the tails removed, worn with a scarlet satin waistcoat. That is not the dinner jacket. That is much closer to a mess jacket, the short tight jacket that waiters and footmen wore, which is why the reporter said the young man looked like a royal footman. The insult was not that the outfit was daring. The insult was that it looked like livery. He looked like staff, which means the most famous version of the story may have the garment wrong. Griswold Lorillard on this reading did not introduce the dinner jacket to America. He wore a mangled tailcoat as a joke and got mocked for it in the papers. And 8 decades later, somebody in the 1930s read the clipping, misunderstood the period vocabulary, and turned a young man's bad night into the founding moment of formal wear. Meanwhile, the actual jacket, the one with the descent from Henry Poole and the Prince of Wales, probably did come through James Brown Potter, and probably did become the Tuxedo Club's dinner uniform, and definitely did take its American name from the place. And there are further complications because dress historians have also found American hybrid jackets that predate 1886 entirely, which suggests the form was already drifting into the country before either man had anything to do with it. So the honest answer is that we do not know who wore what first, and the story we all repeat has at least one significant error inside it, and there is no document that resolves it. What is not in doubt is the name. Whatever the garment was and whoever brought it, the word attached to it is the name of a private park in the Ramapo Mountains, and that word is now used in Sydney and Lagos and Sao Paulo by men who have never heard of Pierre Lorillard and never will, which is escape number 1, and it establishes the pattern for all the rest. Notice what actually got out, not the thing itself. The garment came from London. Tuxedo Park did not invent it, and given the confusion about that first ball, may not even have introduced it. What Tuxedo Park supplied was the association, the word, the claim that this is what the right sort of people wear in the place where the right sort of people are. The park did not export a jacket. It exported a signal that a jacket could carry, and a signal will travel absolutely anywhere, because unlike a jacket, a signal is free. That is going to be true of all 4 escapes. Every one of them is a thing that could be copied without permission. Which brings us to the second one, and this one Tuxedo actually did help build. The American Country Club is such a familiar object now that it is hard to see it as an invention. But it is one, and it is a specific one, and it is not the same as the English clubs it superficially resembles. An English gentleman's club was a building in a city with rooms in it. You went there to read the papers, eat, and avoid your family. It had no grounds, no sport, and no houses attached. The American Country Club is a different animal. It is a piece of land with sport on it, an architectural centerpiece, a social calendar that structures the year, and crucially a membership process with the power to say no. Tuxedo did not invent every part of that. Golf clubs and hunting clubs existed. What Tuxedo did was bolt the club to the real estate, so that the club controlled who could live there, and the facilities tell you how comprehensive the vision was. Over the years, the Tuxedo Club accumulated golf, lawn tennis, court tennis, rackets, squash, boating, and the rest. Around the turn of the century, they built the court tennis building, a structure for a game so old and so obscure that constructing a court for it was essentially a statement that the ordinary sports were insufficiently exclusive. But the sport was never the mechanism. The mechanism was the committee. Every element of the modern American membership process is visible at Tuxedo in the 1880s and 1890s in nearly finished form. You need a proposer. You need a seconder. Your name goes to a board that does not explain itself. There is a cap on numbers, so admitting you means excluding someone else, which makes exclusion feel like arithmetic rather than judgment. And there is a social penalty for anyone who tries to skip the queue. Nobody had to invent blackballing after that. It was already running, in public, at a fashionable address. being copied by every group of ambitious men in every American city who wanted a version of the same thing. And because the country was filling up with newly rich people who had exactly the problem the old families had, which is that they could not tell who was who either, the demand for that machinery was effectively unlimited. Within a generation, there were country clubs outside every significant American city, and every one of them had a membership committee, and every one of those committees had the power to refuse without stating a reason. That is escape number 2, not a building, a procedure. And now the third one, which is the strangest of the 4 because it was carried out of the park by a woman who could not stand living there. Emily Price was born in Baltimore, most likely in October of 1872, the only child of the architect Bruce Price and his wife Josephine. Her father's career was rising steeply through her childhood. The family kept a brownstone in New York and spent summers at Bar Harbor in Maine or at Tuxedo Park, which her father was in the middle of designing and building. She travelled with him to look at his projects. She watched him work. The Emily Post Institute, which her family still runs, makes an observation about this that is worth taking seriously. Bruce Price's gift was for the relationship between a space and the people who would move through it. How a building meets a street corner. How food and guests move through the dining rooms of a hotel. Proportion, balance, and the fit between a structure and the humans inside it. His daughter inherited exactly that gift and applied it to something with no walls. She grew up inside the most formal social system in America, at the moment it was being constructed, in the house of the man constructing it. She had, in other words, an engineer's view of a thing that everybody else experienced as simply the way things are. In 1892, she married Edwin Main Post, a banker at Tuxedo Park. It was the obvious marriage, made in the obvious place, at the obvious age. 2 sons followed. Then it came apart. Edwin lost a great deal of his wife's inherited money in the stock market, and in 1905 he was targeted by a newspaper publisher running a blackmail operation who threatened to expose Edwin's affair with a showgirl unless he paid. Edwin refused to pay. Instead, he helped set up a sting to expose the blackmailer, which required him first to confess the affair to his wife. She had no real choice but to support the plan, which meant the affair became public, in the papers, by her husband's own arrangement. They divorced in 1905, so consider the position of a woman of that class in that year, divorced publicly, with the reason printed, 2 sons to raise, a good deal of her inheritance gone, and a social world in which her marital status was now a permanent qualification on every introduction she would ever receive. She started writing for money, novels first, light society fiction, serialized in magazines, stories about Americans in Europe among the continental gentry, then travel writing, including an account of driving across the United States by car in 1915 with her son, which is a very funny book. She wrote for Vanity Fair and Collier's and McCall's, and then in 1921 or thereabouts an editor at the publishing house Funk and Wagnalls had an idea. This woman had grown up at the centre of best society, as the phrase went, and she could write clearly and she needed money. She should write the book on manners. Post did not want to do it. Her family has been quite open about this. She wrote about etiquette not out of enthusiasm, but because it was the commission in front of her. Etiquette was published in July of 1922 and went straight onto the bestseller list, and it stayed a bestseller, in edition after edition, for the rest of the century and beyond. Now, what that book actually was is not what people assume. It was not written for the people of Tuxedo Park. The people of Tuxedo Park did not need it. They had absorbed all of it before they were 12, from governesses and mothers and the terrible silence that follows a mistake at dinner. Etiquette was written for the people outside. It was aimed squarely at the enormous, growing, anxious American middle class, and at the newly rich in particular, and its purpose was to tell them how to live and speak and eat and write and marry like the wealthy. Within a month of publication, she was buried in letters from readers asking about situations the book had not covered, and those letters shaped every subsequent edition. The audience was, in effect, co-writing it, and that audience was not in the park. So look at what happened. A woman raised inside a fence designed to keep the wrong sort of people away from the right sort of people, took the entire operating manual of that world, wrote it down in plain language, and sold it by mail to the wrong sort of people for about $4. The single most valuable asset Tuxedo Park had was that its codes were unwritten. Unwritten codes cannot be learned by outsiders. That is their whole function. That is why formality that intense exists in the first place. Bowing rather than waving, never using first names. 5 men in the entire town permitted to say Emily. Emily Post published the codes, and she did it without any apparent malice, and largely without being noticed doing it, because a book of manners looks like an instrument of snobbery, rather than what it functionally was, which was a leak. There is a line in the family's own account of her that puts it well without quite saying the quiet part. She had a knack, they write, for dissecting the unwritten social codes of New York society and making sense of them for the emerging industrial middle classes, making sense of them for the people the codes had been designed to catch out. It is worth being careful here, because it would be easy to turn Emily Post into a class warrior, and she was not one. She was a divorced woman who needed an income and had an unusual expertise, and her actual philosophy, stated repeatedly, was not about status at all. She thought good manners began with consideration for other people's feelings, and that the best way to do almost anything was the way that pleased the greatest number and offended the fewest. That is a democratic principle wearing formal clothes. It is also, if you think about it for a second, incompatible with the entire architecture of Tuxedo Park, whose formality existed specifically to offend and exclude a great many people on purpose. She had, by then, left. American Heritage records her among the park's defectors. The daughter of the man who designed the place eventually found its manners too artificial to live with, and went elsewhere. So escape number 3 is a code, carried out of the fence by a woman who was leaving anyway, and sold to everyone the fence had been built to keep away. The garment, the institution, the code. 3 things that got out through a barbed wire fence with an armed patrol on it, because none of the 3 weighed anything. If you are still with me most of the way into a story about a private park in the Ramapo Mountains, that is not a small thing, and subscribing helps this channel keep making the long ones, because the 4th escape is the one that is still running, and before we get to it there is a chapter almost nobody knows about, in which a man living inside that fence began to use it backwards. In 1912, a young man named Alfred Lee Loomis graduated from Harvard, took a job as a corporate lawyer on Wall Street, married well, and settled in Tuxedo Park. On paper, he is the least interesting person in this entire story. He is the exact thing the park was built to contain. Good family, correct education, respectable profession, appropriate wife, right address. He played tennis and golf. He and his wife Ellen appeared in the social columns. Ellen Farnsworth Loomis had been called the most beautiful girl in Boston. There is a detail underneath that surface, though, which is that the Loomis family had name and stature, but not much money. Alfred's father had died suddenly, leaving him responsible for his mother and his sister. His father had also, by all accounts, drunk too much and been openly unfaithful, and the son had grown up carrying the embarrassment of it. His granddaughter later described what that produced. Alfred's rigid propriety, she said, was a kind of penance. So here is a man performing correctness with unusual intensity, in the most correct address in America, for reasons that have nothing to do with belief, and everything to do with a father he was trying not to be, and behind it, a mind that did not fit the job at all. He was interested in the smallest measurable increments of time, in prime numbers, in the outer edges of physics. In his off hours he filed patents for things he'd invented, including a slide rule for calculating securities and a more reliable fire extinguisher. He could play 3 good chess players simultaneously from another room, listening to the moves called out to him down a telephone, and win all 3. For 5 years he bridled. Then in 1917 America entered the war, and Loomis got out. He trained as an officer and, with help from a well-placed cousin, was posted to the Army's Research Center at Aberdeen, Maryland. And there, for the first time in his life, he was in a room full of people doing what he actually wanted to do. He built a device that measured the muzzle velocity of artillery shells far more accurately than anything then in use, which is a direct contribution to the accuracy of the primary weapon of the First World War, produced by a corporate lawyer with no scientific training. The war ended in 1918, and Loomis went back to the law firm, because he had a wife and 3 sons and a mother and a sister to support. But he had seen the alternative. His solution was characteristically direct. If money was the thing keeping him from science, he would go and get an unreasonable amount of it, quickly, and then stop. In 1919, he left law and went into investment banking with his brother-in-law, Landon Thorne. Their business was financing the electrification of rural America, which in 1919 was one of the largest undertakings available, and they were very good at it. Money came in faster than either of them had expected, and while he was making it, Loomis kept in contact with the scientists he had met at Aberdeen. One of them was Robert W. Wood, a flamboyant experimental physicist who spent his summers on Long Island. In the summer of 1924, Loomis drove out to see him and found that Wood had set up an informal laboratory in his barn. Loomis sat down on a stool and did not leave. He later said in effect that this was more fun than the gossip at the yacht club. He asked Wood whether there was any research they might do together, anything that needed funding. Wood mentioned something he had seen in France during the war. Scientists there had built a device for locating submarines that used an oscillator to project a beam of very high-frequency sound. Wood had noticed that fish swimming into the beam turned belly up and died, and that when he put his hand into it, he felt a sharp burning. Nobody knew why. Wood suggested they start there. Loomis did not do things by halves. He bought a General Electric oscillator larger than the French one, installed it in his garage in Tuxedo Park, and pushed the output from 2,000 volts to 50,000. Then the two of them stuffed cotton in their ears, put on ear protection, and switched it on. The experiments that followed were hard on small animals and produced results that were, in the long run, enormously useful. That line of work is one of the foundations of ultrasound, which is to say that the technology used today to look at an unborn child began, in part, in a garage inside a gated community. Powered by a machine the manufacturer never intended anyone to run that hard. By the end of the 20s, Loomis wanted something larger than a garage. He had a model in mind, and the model was British. The gentleman scientists of the 19th century, men like Lord Rayleigh, who had a mansion and a private laboratory in it and did serious work. So he went looking around Tuxedo Park and found a derelict house. It was called Tower House, a large stone mansion that had stood empty for about a decade. Weather-beaten battlements, broken windows, and the sort of local reputation that empty houses on hills always acquire. Children told stories about it. Loomis bought it and began converting it. Trucks came up the winding roads carrying equipment nobody in the park could identify. The bedrooms and the salon and the ballroom were fitted out to accommodate scientists. And then Alfred Loomis did the thing that makes him matter to this story. He started inviting people in. The invitations went out to the best experimental physicists in the world, and they came because the Depression had emptied university budgets, and Tower House had, in the judgment of people who would know, one of the best equipped laboratories in America. 6 to 8 to 10 papers came out of it every year, and they were respected papers. The arrival was theatrical, and deliberately so. A scientist would get off the train at Tuxedo. Loomis's Rolls-Royce would be waiting. The car would carry him in through the enormous stone gates, past the gatehouse, up the narrow winding roads, past 40-bedroom mansions with their stables and their guest houses, and finally to Tower House, where a butler opened the door. Albert Einstein visited. He referred to the compound as a palace of science, and the phrase stuck. The work done there was not a rich man's hobby. Loomis and Wood established the first systematic measurements of the stages of human sleep, at a time when many doctors did not believe brainwaves existed at all. Loomis's view was that the doubters simply had inadequate equipment, so he bought better equipment. For the sleep work he used his own son Henry, who had a gift for falling asleep despite a head full of wires. On one occasion, with the instruments showing that the boy was deeply asleep, Alfred leaned over and whispered that Henry's beloved sailboat was on fire. Henry came off the cot so fast that the wires went flying and tried to climb the wall of the laboratory to get to the boat. What that established, and it was a real finding, is that a sleeping brain is still monitoring the room. What it also establishes is what kind of father Alfred Loomis was, and the family has been candid about that. His sons were sent away to school at 7. Their attempts to impress him mostly went unnoticed. One son came home from boarding school convinced he had finally become good enough at chess to play his father, set the board up on the porch as instructed, and watched Alfred beat him from an armchair in the next room without ever coming outside. He also, over these same years, systematically shut his wife out of his life, and eventually did something considerably worse than that, which we will come to. But now the part that concerns the fence. Look at who was arriving at Tower House through the 1930s. Foreigners, men with heavy accents, European physicists, many of them Jewish, some of them refugees, arriving in numbers, being met by a Rolls-Royce at the station and driven in through the gates. The historian David Zimmerman has stated the situation as plainly as it can be stated. He says he cannot imagine what Loomis's neighbours thought, because many of these arrivals were foreigners, many spoke with foreign accents, and they were also Jews. And Jews, he says, were simply not allowed to live in Tuxedo Park. That is not an inference. The Tuxedo Club's bar on certain ethnic groups was well known, it was maintained for decades, and as late as 1978 a survey of the park noted that the Board of Governors had never seen fit to relax it. So this is the situation. A community whose entire architecture, legal and social and physical, existed to keep certain categories of person outside a fence. And inside that fence one member is flying those exact people in, at his own expense, and housing them. The neighbours noticed. They gossiped. There was talk about strange outlanders with long hair and baggy trousers settling in for weeks and months at a time. The newspapers picked up the more sensational experiments and ran items about a wealthy recluse in a Gothic mansion killing fish and dissecting frogs, under headlines about the whispers of death. Loomis hated the attention. He hated any breach of privacy so much that he resented his own servants, and eventually built himself a modern house next to the laboratory, whose chief selling point was that it allowed a servantless existence. But he did not stop bringing people in, and by 1938 the reason he was bringing them had changed. His granddaughter remembers what turned it. By 1938, she says, no Jew in Germany was permitted to hold an academic position. Alfred told her that was a real warning bell for him. After that, he was not merely inviting scientists, he was paying to bring them over, paying to house them, and finding them jobs. He did that for a number of people. There was, as she puts it, real danger in the air, which is worth stopping on for a moment. The gate at Tuxedo Park was, in that decade, one of the more effective private exclusion mechanisms in the United States. It was doing its job. And a man who lived behind it used the privacy that gate provided to move refugee scientists from Nazi Germany into America and put roofs over them. The fence did not change, its function inverted. The same wall that kept the world out was now keeping the world's business private, while a member of the club conducted an evacuation. And then, on the 16th of January 1939, two men came up the hill. They were Niels Bohr and Enrico Fermi, and between them they represented a substantial fraction of everything the human race then understood about the atom. They had come to tell Loomis something that had happened in a laboratory in Berlin. Scientists had split the atom. Mass had been converted into energy, and potentially into a great deal of energy. Nobody in that room knew whether it could be made into a weapon. What everybody in that room knew was where it had been done, and who was in charge there. Bohr and Fermi left the next morning. Alfred Loomis stayed in the house, and decided, alone, that he was going to spend himself trying to erase Germany's scientific lead. The rest is the reason there is a book and a documentary about him. He dropped his other experiments and threw himself at radar, and specifically at microwave radar, which was the version nobody could build because nobody could make a transmitter powerful enough. His team tried to disguise their equipment by loading it into a laundry truck painted in the Tuxedo Park colours and driving it around the golf course, while his son Henry flew a plane overhead for them to track. Read that sentence again, because it is one of the more remarkable images in American history. The prototype of the technology that would win the air war over Europe was being tested from a diaper truck on a private golf course inside a gated community in the Ramapo Mountains. It was not working. The transmitter problem was unsolvable with what America had. Then, in September of 1940, with London burning, Winston Churchill made one of the great gambles of the war and sent a delegation to the United States carrying Britain's most valuable technical secrets, with instructions to hand them over. On the 19th of September 1940, the night before the formal meetings began, Loomis invited the British scientists up to his suite at the Wardman Park Hotel in Washington. The American admirals in the room were suspicious of the whole exchange and did not want to give anything away. Loomis was not suspicious at all. He wanted to help, openly, and the British decided that night to put their cards on the table. The last thing they showed him was a device called the cavity magnetron. It was a microwave transmitter roughly 1,000 times more powerful than anything the Americans knew existed. It was the exact thing Loomis had been unable to build. One of the British scientists said afterwards that the atmosphere in the room was electric, and that they found it hard to believe that what lay on the table in front of them might be the salvation of the Allied cause. In November of 1940, Alfred Loomis had the Tower House laboratory packed up and shut. The equipment went to Cambridge, Massachusetts, to a new organisation he had helped negotiate into existence at MIT, called the Radiation Laboratory. Everyone called it the Rad Lab. It began with a few dozen people working out of an unheated tar paper hut on a roof. By the end of the war, it had grown to nearly 4,000 people across 15 acres of floor space, spending close to $4 million a month, and its work was on ships, submarines, bombers, and fighters across every theatre of the war. The saying inside the Rad Lab was that the atomic bomb only ended the war, and radar won it. Alfred Loomis never went back to Tuxedo Park. He sold Tower House, the contents of the laboratory, one of the finest private research facilities that has ever existed, were left out for the trash. The Palace of Science lasted about 11 years. There is one more thing about Alfred Loomis that has to be said here, because a promise was made earlier in this and because leaving it out would make him into something he was not. Through the late 1930s, while he was bringing refugee physicists into Tuxedo Park at his own expense, Loomis was conducting an affair with Minette Hobart, the wife of his own longtime protégé in the same house. His wife Ellen had been slowly pushed to the outside of his life for a decade. She had tried to keep up with the science. She wrote that she wished she knew more about what Alfred was doing because he seemed so happy in the laboratory. Then came the migraines, and the woman who had been called the most beautiful girl in Boston stopped being recognizable to the people who had known her. For years, Loomis sent her away to sanatoriums, officially for her health, and by the spring of 1945 he attempted to have her committed permanently. According to a daughter-in-law, nobody was allowed to write to her or speak to her. No visits from her children, no calls from her husband. She believed she'd been dumped there and abandoned. Janet Conant, who wrote the only biography of Loomis and who had access to his papers, states plainly what happened. He used his influence to get a doctor to sign the papers. He locked her away. On the 4th of April 1945, Alfred and Ellen Loomis were divorced. A few hours later, he married Minette. When his eldest son came home from the war and discovered what had been done to his mother, he went and got her out. She lived the rest of her life largely as a recluse, cared for by nurses, and never fully recovered. So the man who used the fence to smuggle scientists out of Hitler's reach also used every ounce of the same privacy, and the same money, and the same deference the place afforded him, to have his wife shut away where nobody could hear her. Both of those things happened inside the same walls, done by the same man, in the same years. Neither cancels the other, and the story is not improved by pretending one of them away. That is the last thing the gate at Tuxedo Park was good for. It did not care what was going on behind it. And that is the second time the fence gets used against itself, though nobody inside it seems to have understood what had happened. The park had built a boundary to keep out foreigners, outsiders, and Jews. What that boundary actually produced in the end was a private, unobserved, extremely well-funded space in which a member could do exactly the opposite, at scale, without anyone asking him about it. A wall does not have opinions. It only has a shape, and whoever holds the gate decides what the shape is for. Meanwhile, the park itself had been losing, slowly and then quickly, to an opponent the fence was not designed for. Pierre Lorillard IV was long gone by then. About 10 years after the opening, his marriage had deteriorated past the point of pretense, and he left to live with a mistress, which in that community was a considerably larger act than it sounds. He kept firm control of the Tuxedo Park Association regardless. He died in 1901 at 68 and left his remaining holdings in trust for his grandchildren. His son Pierre V, and later his grandson Pierre VI, carried on the dynasty with steadily diminishing energy. But the founder's departure was not the problem. The problem arrived by statute. In 1913, the United States adopted a federal income tax. Estate taxes followed and grew. Now, consider what the residents of Tuxedo Park actually lived on. Very few of them worked, and working for a living was regarded with open suspicion by many of the originals. Bankers and financiers were acceptable, because they dealt with money in its more abstract and dignified forms, but the substrate underneath the whole community was inherited capital, held in trusts, throwing off dividends and interest. That income stream was now taxable, and the estates that produced it were taxable when they passed. A fence is a very good technology for stopping a person. It is completely useless against a change in the tax code, which does not need to enter through the gate. It arrives by mail, and the architecture made it worse because the park had spent 30 years engaged in an arms race with itself. The original Bruce Price cottages had been modest by Gilded Age standards, if you accept that modest meant 5 to 10 bedrooms. About 100 of those went up in the first dozen years, tucked into hillsides, deliberately unimpressive from the outside. Then came what the American Heritage account of the park calls the pretentious period, and by the turn of the century it was epidemic. Even Lauralard's disapproval could not stop it. Charles B. Alexander, a corporation lawyer married to a California gold rush heiress, put up a castellated brick and stone house with a full ballroom. Henry W. Poor immediately overshadowed it with an enormous Tudor manor. There was a strange fashion for physically relocating existing cottages to better sites. Older houses were enlarged, sometimes to double their original size. One was expanded to the point that it required 14 rooms just to house the servants. The winners were the Mortimers, who abandoned their cosy cottage in 1905 for a 54-room villa in the Italian manor. And what really settled the contest was not the villa. It was the entrance, a massive iron gate flanked by a pair of stone lions, and a long avenue lined with marble busts of Roman emperors leading visitors to the door. A private gate inside the private gate, with its own guardian statuary. These houses were built on the assumption that the money would keep arriving in the same quantities, and that servants would keep being available in the same numbers, and that both assumptions would hold forever. Then came 1929, and the Depression, and the whole structure met arithmetic. Trust income collapsed as dividends faded and bonds defaulted. Cottages were boarded up to save on maintenance, and some of the great manor houses were pulled down, deliberately, not because they were unsound, but because demolishing a building removes it from the tax assessment. That is a remarkable thing to picture. A family taking a wrecking crew to a 50-room house that their grandparents built, in order to stop paying tax on it. The pretentious period ended by being knocked over for accounting reasons. The club felt it directly. Membership had been over 500 before the crash. By 1936 it was under half that. In 1941 the governors did something that would have been unthinkable in Gould Hoyt's day. They invented a discount. For $50 a year, anyone living more than 20 miles from the clubhouse could become an associate member with all the privileges of a full member except the right to vote at meetings. It worked. New faces came in, and a surprising number of existing members switched to the cheap tier, which tells you a good deal about how thin things had become behind the fence. By 1944, associate members outnumbered full members, 189 to 186. The club that had once capped itself at 200 gentlemen of distinction was now majority discount, and there was a third pressure larger than the tax code and larger than the Depression, which almost nobody inside the park saw coming because it involved thinking about the people outside it. We need to go back to the fence and to the shanties on the wrong side of it. The 1,800 men who built Tuxedo Park in 8 months did not go home when it was finished. Many of them stayed because the park needed staff, and staff needed to live somewhere within walking distance. They and their families settled in the village outside the boundary. Their sons and daughters worked in the park. Their grandsons and granddaughters worked in the park. This was the arrangement for 3 generations. The park took the benefits of a feudal relationship and, by the frankest account of it, did not take on the corresponding obligations. Residents were largely indifferent to conditions on the other side of the line. It did not appear to trouble them that a great many villagers were still living in the same wretched shanties their grandfathers had thrown up in 1885. The vocabulary made the arrangement explicit. People inside were residents of the park, people outside were the villagers, and the word was not neutral. The clearest single illustration comes from politics. Catherine Saint. George was the congresswoman for the district, a Republican and an aristocrat, and when she addressed an election rally in Tuxedo, she distinguished between the two halves of her own audience out loud, from the podium. "Ladies of the park," she would say, nodding to a small group at the front. And then, with a sweeping glance across everybody else in the room, and women of the village, ladies at the front, women at the back, same rally, same constituency, same vote each, which is presumably why she was there. That was the system, and for about 60 years it held because the villagers had no realistic alternative. There was no other employer, education was limited and money was short, and the park was what there was. Then it stopped holding, and it stopped holding for the simplest possible reason. The younger generations got better educated, saw other options, and declined to spend their lives in service without any of the security that older forms of service had at least nominally provided. They left, domestics left, gardeners left, cooks and chauffeurs and maids left, and did not come back, and were not replaced. The American Heritage Survey of the park delivers the verdict on this in one dry sentence. In the end, it says, the defection of domestics and gardeners was far more disastrous than that of Willie Astor. William Waldorf Astor had been Tuxedo's richest and most aristocratic resident, and he had quit America in 1890 in a public huff, announcing that with the exception of Tuxedo, the country was not a fit place for a gentleman to live. He moved to England, became more English than the English, and eventually got himself a hereditary title, which is a level of social security that even Tuxedo could not supply. His departure was a scandal. It changed nothing. The departure of the gardeners ended the world, because a 54-room villa is not a house. It is a machine, and it requires an operating crew, and if the crew is unavailable at any price, the machine simply stops. A cottage with 14 rooms for servants and no servants in them is not a grand house. It is a maintenance liability with a lawn. The fence had been built to control who could come in. It had never occurred to anyone that the more serious problem would be people declining to come in. You cannot conscript a labour force with a gatehouse. The gate only works on people who want to get past it, and the moment they stop wanting to, it is just an expensive piece of stonework on an empty road. Which is the point at which the Lorillard dynasty produced of all things a reformer. Pierre Lorillard VI took over as head of the family in 1940, after his father Pierre V. He was a confirmed bachelor already in his late 50s, and by the standards of the park he was a scandal in his own right, because he lived in Spartan rooms above the tennis club and openly mocked social pretension. His diagnosis was that the park was dying of its own architecture and its own snobbery, and his prescription was radical. Tear down the white elephants, all of them. Replace them with modern houses that a family on a $5,000 income could actually afford to live in. And when the subject of who ought to be admitted came up, the great-grandson of the founder said something that would have caused Gouldhoyt physical pain. "We want red-blooded young people," he said, "who may have only very moderate incomes. What is blue blood, anyway? I never was able to find out." The head of the dynasty that invented American exclusivity, asking out loud what the qualification was actually supposed to be, and reporting that in 6 decades nobody had ever managed to tell him. He did not get everything he wanted. In early 1942, outside professional management was brought into the Tuxedo Park Association for the first time, which was its own kind of surrender, and a compromise program went ahead. New houses in the $8,000 to $10,000 range went up on some of the empty land. Elegant stables and carriage houses were converted into apartments. But the surviving follies of the pretentious period were left standing, because nobody could quite bring themselves to finish the job. Pierre Lorillard VI died in 1943 at 61, without seeing how it turned out. What followed was an orderly retreat, conducted over decades, and it is worth listing the stages because each one removes a piece of the original machine. The great houses of the pretentious period vanished or were converted to institutional use. The Mortimer's Italian villa with the lions and the Roman emperors went. The site went under weeds. Their original modest cottage, the one they had abandoned in 1905 because it was insufficiently grand, is still standing. The park's territory shrank to roughly a third of what it had been. What did survive is the architecture of the modest period, and it survived because it was modest. A 5-bedroom shingled cottage tucked into a hillside can be lived in by an ordinary prosperous family in the 20th century. A 54-room Italian villa cannot be lived in by anybody. By 1916 there had been more than 250 houses and stables built inside the park. A great many of the early ones are still there, and in 1980 the whole place was entered on the National Register of Historic Places as a historic district, which is a designation that arrives, as a rule, at the moment something has stopped being a going concern and started being a specimen. Bruce Price's own 4 cottages on Pepperidge Road are still standing. His daughter inherited all 4 and divided the property in 1920. People live in them now. One of them was for years the home of a Broadway actress, which is a sentence that would have caused the Board of Governors of 1886 to require a lie-down. The buildings outlasted the system that produced them, which is the usual order of events. Stone and shingle are patient. Rules are not, unless somebody keeps enforcing them. In 1971, the Autumn Ball was cancelled. The event that had opened the New York social season for 85 years, at which Griswold Lorillard had or had not invented the tuxedo, was called off because the young women of the park were no longer interested in being formally presented to anybody. And the fence came down, not in a single dramatic act. It came down the way fences do, in sections, as it rusted, and as the money for the patrol dried up and as the ground it enclosed was sold off. The 8-foot barbed wire and the private constabulary and the 24 miles, or 8 miles, or however many miles it actually was, simply stopped existing. The physical thing that the entire enterprise had been named for, photographed for, and built around is gone. The club's ethnic taboo lasted longer than the fence did. As late as the late 1970s, the Board of Governors had still never formally relaxed it. But by then the board's authority ran only to the club and not to the land. And there were by that point a number of Jewish families living perfectly comfortably in Tuxedo Park, without club membership and without finding it, in Gould Hoyt's word, unpleasant. Which meant that the loop he had described so confidently was broken. It had been possible all along to be a resident of the park and not be admitted to the club. It had just required somebody to try it. So by the end of the 20th century, the fence is down, the ball is cancelled, the great houses are demolished, the dynasty is gone, the servants are gone, and the club is admitting the people it was founded to exclude. By every measure that Pierre Lorillard IV would have recognised, Tuxedo Park lost. And this is the point where the story is supposed to end, with a decline and a moral and some drone footage of a stone gate in the trees, except that it does not end there, because of the fourth escape. Remember the rule, not the fence. The rule. Membership precedes ownership. You are approved, and then you are permitted to buy. The committee's authority attaches to the land and travels with it to every subsequent owner forever, without any need for a wall, a patrol, or a strand of wire. That is the thing that got out. And unlike the tuxedo, and unlike the country club, and unlike Emily Post's book, this one did not need a person to carry it. It only needed to be written into a deed, and deeds are photocopied. But a rule written into a deed in 1886 has one weakness, and it took a man in Kansas City to fix it. The weakness is enforcement. A developer sells the last lot, takes his money, and leaves. After that, who exactly is going to police the covenants? And covenants of that era usually ran for a fixed term, often 10 years, after which they expired unless every owner agreed to renew, which never happened, because getting 100 households to sign anything is impossible. So the restrictions would lapse, and buyers 3 or 4 years in would start to worry about what would happen when they did, and hesitate to build at all. The man who solved that was Jesse Clyde Nichols, and he did it about 20 miles south of downtown Kansas City, starting around 1908, in a development he called the Country Club District. He named it after the country club he put at the middle of it, which by then was simply what you did. Nichols did 2 things that finished the machine. The first was to make the restrictions self-perpetuating. Instead of expiring unless owners voted to renew, his covenants renewed themselves automatically at the end of each term, unless a majority of owners actively went to the trouble of killing them, years in advance, in writing. He inverted the burden. Silence now meant continuation rather than expiry. The Country Club District is generally identified as the first place in the United States where that was done. The second thing was the enforcer. Nichols required every homeowner to belong to a homes association, a private company for the subdivision that collected dues, ran the trash collection, and swept the streets, and, underneath the services, existed to enforce the covenants in perpetuity long after the developer had gone. He did not invent restrictive covenants, and he did not invent homeowners associations. What he did was weld them together into a self-running mechanism that needed nobody's continuing consent, and then he spent 40 years telling every developer in America to copy it, through the national real estate and home building associations he was prominent in. By the 1940s, mandatory homeowners associations were ordinary across the United States, and what those covenants controlled was not only lawns and setbacks and minimum construction costs, though it was those too. In the Country Club District and in Nichols, Kansas developments, the covenants also barred black and Jewish people from owning or occupying the houses. His advertising did not hide the logic. More than 1,000 acres, one 1908 advertisement said, restricted for those who want protection. Protection is the word. It is the same word the brochures use now, and it is doing the same work it did at Tuxedo, which is to make an act of exclusion sound like an act of insurance. That model went national. The federal government later adopted the restrictive covenant approach in its own lending rules, which is a substantial part of how American suburbs were segregated by paperwork rather than by law. The Supreme Court finally made racial covenants unenforceable in 1948, in Shelley versus Kramer, and the informal practice ran on for decades afterwards. So the line runs like this. Lorillard establishes that approval must precede ownership, and that the club, not the market, decides who lives there. Nichols works out how to make that decision permanent, automatic, and enforceable, without a founder, a fence, or a constabulary. After that, it does not need a mountain, or a lake, or 1,800 men, or a tobacco fortune. It needs a filing cabinet. So the honest question to close on is the one we started with. How far did it get? In the 1970s, there were roughly 2,000 gated residential communities in the United States. Most of them were retirement villages or compounds for the very rich, which is to say they were still recognizably Tuxedo's children. By the 1990s, the researchers Edward Blakely and Mary Gale Snyder estimated around 20,000 of them, containing more than 3 million households. The 2001 American Housing Survey, run by the Census Bureau, found over 7 million households living in communities surrounded by walls or fences. By 2009, that figure was reported at close to 11 million, and then the 2015 survey, which is the last one that asked, gives the clearest picture we have. Of about 106 million occupied year-round housing units in the United States, 7,058,000 households reported living in a community surrounded by walls or fences. That is 5.9%. Of those, 4,013,000 reported that access to their community was controlled by some means: gates, codes, key cards, a guard. That is 3.4% of all American households, which is to say roughly 1 in every 30 homes in the country. 7 million walls, 4 million gates. Buried in that data is the finding that reverses the entire story, and it is the reason this is worth an hour and a half of anybody's time. Renters were nearly 2.5 times more likely than owners to live in a walled or fenced community, and they were more than 3 times as likely to have controlled access. Read that again, because it is the opposite of what everyone assumes. The gate in modern America is not primarily a rich person's object. It is disproportionately found around the homes of people who do not own their homes at all, and that category includes public housing, which has been built with walls and controlled entries for decades. Pierre Lorillard built a fence to keep the poor away from the rich. A century and a half later, the poor are behind more fences than the rich are. The wall changed clients. The mechanism did not. And it is worth asking why it travelled so well, because the answer is not simply that people are snobs. The rule Lorillard wrote solves a problem that any group of people buying property together actually has, which is that the value of your house depends heavily on decisions made by people you did not choose. Your neighbour's paint colour, your neighbour's extension, whether the lot next door becomes a house or a car park. A membership committee with authority over the deed answers that. It gives a group of strangers a way to bind each other's future behaviour in advance, permanently, without involving a government. That is a real and useful invention, and it is why it did not stay in the Ramapo Mountains, and it is why most of the 7 million households behind walls today are not thinking about Pierre Lorillard at all. They are thinking about resale value and about who mows the verge. The difficulty is that the mechanism has no opinion about what it is used to exclude. The same clause that stops your neighbour building a car park is the clause that, through most of the 20th century, kept black families out of American suburbs by writing it into the deed, until the court stopped enforcing those covenants in 1948 and the practice continued informally for decades afterwards. A committee that can refuse without giving a reason is an extremely efficient tool, and efficiency is neutral. That is the whole problem with it, and always has been. And in 2017, the American Housing Survey removed the secured communities question from the survey entirely, which means the most recent reliable national count of how many Americans live behind a wall is from 2015, and nobody has counted since. We built so many of them that we stopped keeping track. So, the 4 escapes, in order. A garment, which came from London, took its name from the park, and is now worn on every continent by people who have never heard of the place. An institution, the American Country Club with a membership committee that need not explain itself, copied into every city in the country within a generation. A code, written down by the architect's daughter, and sold to the exact people it had been designed to catch out, and a rule which needed no fence at all and which now stands around roughly 7 million American households. The fence at Tuxedo Park failed at everything it was built to do. It did not keep out new money, which was inside within 2 years. It did not keep the residents in, because the ones with any spirit escaped through the holes in it, and said so. It did not stop the income tax, or the estate tax, or the depression. It could not make a single gardener stay. And it succeeded completely at the one thing nobody involved intended, which is that it turned out to be sellable. That is what Lorillard actually invented in those 8 months in 1885 and 1886. Not a town, a product. Every gated development advertised today with an aerial photograph of an entrance is selling the same thing he was. Not the land and not the house, but the guarantee about who else will be permitted to stand next to you. The wall is not there to stop anybody. The wall is there so that you can see what you paid for. Which brings us back up the hill, to the only structure in this story still doing its original job. The great houses came down, the ball was cancelled, the fence rusted away, the Lorillards died out. Tuxedo Park is now an incorporated village of a few hundred people, with private roads and its own small police force on about a third of the ground it once held. And at the entrance, exactly where Bruce Price put it in 1886, the stone gatehouse is still standing, and there is still somebody in it. Look at that building for a second and it rearranges itself. For 140 years, people have looked at that lodge and seen a barrier, a thing whose purpose is to stop you. That was never quite right, even at the beginning. The barrier was always the rule, and the rule lived in a filing cabinet in an office, in the minutes of a committee, in a clause in a deed. The gatehouse was doing a different job. It was the part you could see from the road. It was the proof, rendered in stone, that the rule existed and was being enforced, but where the people it excluded would drive past it. The gatehouse was never the lock. It was the sign advertising the lock. That is why it outlived the fence, and the ball, and the family, and the club's authority, and the entire social order it was built to protect. A sign only has to be looked at, and people are still looking. Roughly 1 American household in 30 now has a version of that same sign at the end of its own road, put there for the same reason, doing the same work. Pierre Lorillard IV put 1,800 men on a mountainside for 8 months to build a wall around a lake, and he thought he was keeping the world out. What he was actually doing was writing the advertisement, and the world read it, and bought it, and built 7 million copies. There is one more thing worth knowing about this valley, and it is not behind the gate. It is in the village, in the houses the builders' families never left, and in the record of what happened to the men who came off the boats in 1885 and put up a town in 8 months for people who would not let them through the gate they were building. That story has almost never been told, and it is the other half of this one.